Hi folks, welcome to the third mini lecture in week 1 of Geography 4880. We've covered classical geography, medieval geography, Renaissance geography, Enlightenment geography, geography of the 19th century and early 20th centuries, and the emergence of modern geography. And now we're going to overview contemporary geography. It's the whole focus of the course, and we're going to spend the next several weeks really digging into the various aspects of contemporary geography, but we are going to overview it now, and in particular overview it from the perspective of the philosophy of science. So just look at different ways in which geographers approach observing the world, okay? That's our goal for this mini lecture in particular. We'll start here with noting that modern geography, starting in the early 1900s, grew to be institutionalized, by which I mean that the study of the Earth and all the different ways that we've seen came to be formalized as a discipline housed in universities and academic departments. It became professionalized, okay? So it went from, upper class or noble or elite explorers, philosophers, individual wealthy people, to academics, okay, to people who often from the middle class who did this as a living and not just a sort of speculative thing from the armchair, okay, and became scientific inquiry and critical reflection became much more a part of what geography is at this time. Again, we're talking early part of the 20th century. So instead of just philosophizing from your armchair, as Kant, von Humboldt, Ratzel, etc. did, what we see here is more of an approach to geography as in terms of scientific inquiry. Kinds of scientific inquiries we understand the modern 20th and 21st centuries to be comprised of. So we'll dig into that. What do I actually mean by the institutionalization of geography? Well, we see its development into societies and ultimately its housing within universities. So the first societies of geography were wealthy white men came together to chat about their explorations was in the 1820s. Okay, so we have a society in Paris, a society in Berlin, eventually a society in London. The Royal Society of Geography still lives on in Britain. It's the main entity for geography over there. It had important members, including Darwin. They funded research expeditions around the world through private donations and members. Okay, this is like a club. Okay. But it wasn't until the late part of the 19th century where this club grew to be a bit more formal when UK universities started hiring professors in geography. So Mackinder, who we talked about last time, was that first full-time professor. He was hired at Oxford University. Geography is entering German and French curricula at this time. World War I really inspired public interest in geography education. So we see that more incorporated into university degrees. So we have a degree in geography at Liverpool during the war. The London School of Economics, Cambridge, all formed geography departments and degrees during World War I. In North America, very similar timeline. We see geography formed at Berkeley in 1898. At similar time periods, also at the other Ivy League institutions like Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and Penn. Those are in red here because those geography departments and programs at Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and Penn no longer exist. Okay, so in many ways, in the Ivy Leagues, geography had its heyday and was abandoned in the middle part of the 20th century. And in only some ways is making a resurgence at those elite institutions. The broader point there being that throughout the later part of the 20th century, geography was more of a popular kind of discipline, not something you could find at those Ivy League institutions, but something that was a sort of staple at publicly run institutions. We see journals and academic work, publication work emerging at this time as well. So the American Association of Geographers, which was previously known as the Association of American Geographers, published its annals for the first time in 1911. The Institute of British Geographers put out their transactions in 1935, so on and so forth. So now that we kind of have a sense for geography as an institution comprised of professionals who publish things in journals and award degrees at universities, let's take a step back and think more broadly about what contemporary geographers in those institutions, how they approach the discipline, how they do their work, and specifically how we observe the world. Observing the world as a geographer is no straightforward, or any scientist for that matter, is no straightforward manner. Okay, there are different philosophies or paradigms, as I believe your text refers to them, for approaching observation. Okay, obviously observation, seeing the world around us, making sense of it, is fundamental to what we do as social or physical scientists. But there's no one straightforward way or theory for doing those observations, for which way of observing the world is best. That is very abstract, so let's dig into it. What we're going to review is geographers tend to take three different ways or approaches to observing the world around us. The first of which we'll see is positivism and empiricism. We see this in the 20th century and today in some spatial science, including remote sensing and GIS, as well as physical geography, and perhaps to some degree human geography. Certainly in the middle part of the 20th century, we would have seen more of this kind of approach in human geography. But much human geography today takes the approach of what we'll call structuralism, as well as post-structuralism and indeed postmodernism. So we'll review all of what that means over the next 2 mini lectures. We'll start with positivism and empiricism. Positivism is an approach to observation that says observation, looking at the world around us, provides the foundation for all knowledge. And in particular, human sensory experience provides that foundation. That's empiricism. So looking at the world around us, or sensing the world around us, going out and looking at a plant, or looking at a stream, or looking at a mountain, or observing cultures and their interactions. That firsthand experience is what we know as empiricism. And for positivism, that's really the basis of everything. Observation, under the tenets of positivism, is untainted by theoretical presuppositions. That is to say that for positivists, observations that we make of the world are theory neutral. Okay, they're not influenced by any sort of preconceptions that we have of the world. They're just observations. The plant is red, the river is white, sinuous, so on and so forth. Observation yields basic facts, atomistic bits of objective knowledge about the world, okay? And theory about how the world works is developed inductively. That is to say, it's built up from those little building blocks of facts into something that we could call theory that explains or describes how something works in the world. So that's actually where the term positivism comes from, in the sense that knowledge is built positively, okay, up from these building blocks of facts, okay, to get to theories that can explain, describe what's going on in the world, okay? So a theory, might be that landforms evolve over time to become to reach a sort of equilibrium state. Rivers come to be equilibrium in an equilibrium with their surroundings. And we developed that theory through observation of those river systems, firsthand experience looking at those river systems. Our observations, you know, we don't come in with that theory firsthand or sort of pre-formed. Okay, we're just out looking at river systems and watching how they develop. Okay, we might get some basic facts such as how sinuous a river system is, you know, how fast water is moving through it, how much water is being discharged to that river system, so on and so forth. Those basic facts we build up, maybe in comparison with a bunch of different river systems, and those basic facts positively lead us to the theory that rivers reach an equilibrium with their surroundings, okay? So in short, positivism is sees science as the study and verification of real empirical observable phenomena to establish laws. Think Darwin here, just as another example. We haven't quite reached it here. But, you know, Darwin traveled the world, observed, you know, the differences between species on islands versus mainlands, observed how those species were different, and built up from those atomistic facts and real empirical observable things to come up with a theory of evolution. Darwin performed measurements to come up with his theory or law of evolution, all right? The idea of positivism doesn't start with Darwin, however. It starts with this person here, Auguste Comte, who could be said to really be a sociologist, not a geographer, but really put forward the notion of positivism. This is not something that is limited to physical geography. It might be today, but it has been applied to human societies. Indeed, since Comte was writing in the early part of the 1800s, okay, his idea was that we could take basic facts about human beings, height, weight, you know, size of your head, so on and so forth, in order to those are real empirical measurable things to develop understandings or theories, laws about human societies and how they function. Okay, so the key thing here is we go from measurement to laws. We go from measuring river systems and their sinuosity to laws about how they become in equilibrium with their surroundings. We go from measurements of bird species, turtle species, and whatever else Darwin was studying, and how they differ from one another, to theories and laws about evolution. Okay. This is different. Positivism is different, a different way of approaching science than what emerged in the 1950s through the work of Karl Popper. We know this as falsification. So this might actually seem more familiar to you, those of you who are more steeped in the physical science realm. Falsification is an approach to science that sees it as criticism of knowledge claims and theories, subjecting them to tests. So instead of positivism, where we take, you know, observations, facts, and we develop theories from them, here in falsification, we take theories and we attempt to disprove them. We have a hypothesis based on a theory, hypothesis about how rivers work, about how human societies work, about whatever. And we conduct experiments, we take measurements to disprove that hypothesis. Falsification says we can never positively prove something. We can never definitively, fully, indeed positively say, this is true. The only thing we can do is say we have, rejected the null hypothesis or whatever in order to, understand whether our theory is valid or not. So let's sum it up. Positivism, we're really representing the world around us. We're doing field observation, measuring things, describing things that we empirically firsthand see. Okay, we're out taking measurements of the soil. We're out, characterizing stream sinuosity. We're out looking at differences between plant species or individuals of plant species. And that is going to help us develop, laws of science. Logical empiricism, though, is somewhere in between positivism and, this falsification thing we just looked at. Okay, so logical empiricism still relies on firsthand observations of the world, but in a bit more of an intervening kind of manner. Okay, so logical empiricists, which emerged in the early part of the 1900s, 1920s, with folks like Whitehead, and said, all right, we don't just need to go out and observe things. We can actually experiment, okay, in our labs or in other ways in order to develop measurements that might lead us to laws, fundamental laws. But in the 1950s, we see the emergence of falsification approaches, which we could also describe as post-positivists, or indeed critical rationalism. So they're all about theorizing, okay, hypothesizing, as well as experimenting and testing in order to falsify ideas, or try to falsify ideas and ultimately then to refine them. Okay, so we take theories, test them either through measurements or experiments, and that leads us to better theories. So that's the idea there between about falsification. So let's look at this a bit more concretely about how each of these approaches to scientific observation might lead us to look at a particular landscape in different ways. I'm going to lead you to the Gulf Coast of the United States, the Gulf of Mexico, and the state of Louisiana, where an important geographical issue is the question of river restoration. The US state of Louisiana is losing about a football field worth of land an hour, okay, due to various different factors that we'll look at in just a second. In part, climate change. And we want to know if restoring some of these wetlands that are being lost to the Gulf will actually work, okay? So you can see here maps of where land loss have occurred. You can look at some of the patterns of land loss from satellite as well as from aerial imagery. How would these different approaches to scientific observation think about river restoration? Well, there are different theories for river restoration. So some scientists theorize that reconnecting the Mississippi River, the main river in that area, will rebuild land because the Mississippi River will deliver new sediment, essentially new land building material, to the wetlands that are subsiding and degrading and causing land loss. Some scientists theorize that reconnecting the river will actually degrade the land that is still remaining because it will deliver new, fresh, nutrient-laden water. So all the fertilizers that farmers in the US are applying in the Midwest to farm fields run off through the Mississippi River and opening up the river to its basin, as we see here in the upper right-hand image, might actually move some of those nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, into those areas, causing plant growth, which might stabilize land, but also might actually overload existing marshes with nutrients. Too much fertilizer can be a bad thing. And finally, another theory is that reconnecting the river is just futile because no matter what we do to restore it, its natural processes, climate change is just going to swamp out whatever we attempt because of stronger storms, sea level rise, and so on. Now, those are our theories. We have data here in terms of analogies from other river systems that have built up new land over time, including the Wax Lake Delta. We have models for how the river connects to its basin. Basically, that's just predictions based on different assumptions about how rivers work and how much sediment is in them. And we also have ancient river cores. So scientists going out and actually drilling cores into the soils to identify where rivers were, where the Mississippi River course was in the past. So how might research based on these different approaches to observation, positivism, logical empiricism, falsification, or post-positivism actually help us with river restoration. Now, I haven't properly set up this for you to go out and do it on your own, so I'm going to lead us through it. But remember here that in our representing or positivist mode of observation, we're really focused on field work, measurement, description. In the logical empiricist approach, we're really focused on intervention, experimentation. Laws are fundamental and constant. And in the falsification or theorizing mode, we're hypothesizing, experimenting, testing, ultimately to falsify or not a theory and refine it. So in terms of a more positive approach, we might draw on land cover data, okay? Empirical observations of the world. We have monitoring stations embedded throughout the course, throughout the coast, and that might help us develop measures of land built or lost and their correlations with other factors. So we might know that we see more land lost in this part of the coast, correlated with more oil and gas wells occurring in that part of the coast, okay? Another thing we can empirically measure, we can see those oil and gas wells and measure them, count them. A key strength here to this approach is that we could do it remotely in near real time, which enables quick responses, okay? Some weaknesses, really we're just making basic correlations between things like land loss or even land built and other factors, dimensions. So we're just looking at outcomes, we're not able to describe specific processes. And this is a real fundamental limitation of positivism. It doesn't necessarily attempt to explain anything. It often ends up at a point where it's just describing two empirically visible things of our world. Oil and gas wells and the number of them, and the number of acres of land built, okay? Doesn't necessarily lead us to make predictions or help us make predictions, although it might be able to. And we may not be able with land cover data to be able to say anything about the quality or sustainability of land built. In terms of intervening, well, we can't really do experiments with the Mississippi River. It's a huge river. It's very hard to do in vivo or live actual experiments with something that grand, just as it's very hard to do experiments with the climate. So instead we turn in climate science and in river science to models and simulations of how rivers interact with their basins. So we could calibrate our models against historical data that maybe we've collected and run projections that predict what land loss will look like and how land might be built. Strengths here, we're incorporating logical observations that allows us to do scenarios, which are basically experiments. What if we, put in a river restoration project here? What would happen? Can't necessarily test that in real life, but we can test it in our computers models. Okay, so again, this is that kind of logical empiricist approach where we're experimenting, intervening. Just we happen to be doing it in simulation form on our computers. This is really makes things cheaper. But some weaknesses here is that the future is unpredictable. There's stochasticity. That just means randomness. Okay, so we can't perfectly predict what's going to happen as a result of our experiments. We can simulate them. There's always going to be uncertainty. And finally, a falsification or post-positivist approach would lead us to take theories that we have and test them. So, in order to falsify a theory about how the river responds to climate change, we might go out and get data, in particular core samples, that help us to map out ancient riverbeds, and then see how that relates, either falsifies or supports the theory that climate change basically swamps out anything the river can do in terms of land building. Okay, so the key strengths of this approach is it has the potential to falsify our theories. That theory that says, well, we can't do anything about land restoration because climate change is too overwhelming. Well, no, we can actually test that theory by looking to past historical data. Problem is that what's happening now in modern times is different than what's in the past. So there's not necessarily that one-to-one correlation that enables us to perfectly test theories. And of course, it can take a lot of time to collect this kind of data, as many of you physical geographers might know. So that really extended example is about leading us to further understanding of different approaches to observation within physical geography in particular, okay? It leads us in some ways to raise this question of, well, to what extent is physical geography a science? I should note that there are so many physical geographers working on on this particular issue in Louisiana. Nonetheless, oftentimes people question, how is physical geography a science? We don't see a lot of physical geographers wearing lab coats and working with beakers, although that certainly does happen. We don't have the same sort of experimental apparatuses that chemists or physicists or even biologists might have. Instead, well, we'll get to the instead in just a second, but let's start just at a very basic level about this question. Well, okay, if we're trying to understand how physical geography is a science, just like chemistry and physics, let's ask ourselves this: how do scientists in general gain and verify knowledge about the world? Well, I'd invite you to come up with a list. Here's the list that I've come up with. Scientists consult their peers in social networks. Maybe not the first thing that we think of when we think of science, but science is a collective endeavor. Okay, so we consult our peers in social networks. We seek insight from trusted authorities. Okay, so we look to the literature. We do make personal observations, whether they're measurements or just observations that we make with our senses out in the field. We collect and analyze data as a part of that, formulate and test theories, we make arguments, okay? And how we do each of those depends on whether we take a positivist or post-positivist or logical empiricist approach. But generally, this is what scientists do. So does that line up with what physical geographers do? Absolutely. And it also describes a lot of what we do in just everyday life, like buying a car. We might look at what peers have to say about buying a car and seek insight from trusted authorities like blue books. And obviously, we're going to go test drive cars and collect maybe some data from that. We might develop a theory about which makes and models are best. And we'll make arguments to our partners about which car we should buy. So science, in many ways, describes what we do on an everyday basis, as well as what we do in physical geography. What makes physical geography different is that it's a formalized process of doing all these things, okay? So within physical geography, we have subdisciplines with organized, tested, and generally agreed upon specialized methods and journals and institutions, okay? Which is somewhat different than our approach to buying a car, right? There's no we don't really formalize that process as individuals. Of course, we do that in a science like physical geography. And to wrap up our question of, what makes physical geography a science? Or is it a science like chemistry, physics that do experiments in the lab? What makes physical geography a lab like, or a science like those, is that physical geographers do place-based case study research. Okay, they go out to Elora Gorge, they go out to field sites in Alberta, okay? And those place-based field labs are the analogies for what physics and chemistry do in their labs on campus, right? Now, whether physical geographers make active interventions and experiments with those plots is a different question. And we could talk more about how physical geographers try to replicate experiments or set up experiments when it's hard to do so in actual places. But That's the analogy. We pick cases in order to develop our science and physical geography. And we'll end here with just a brief little bit of the history of physical geography. We shortchanged it in our previous mini lecture, where we were really focused in on human geography and human environment geographers in the 19th and early 20th centuries. But of course, physical geography was developing at that time as well. Biogeography, geomorphology, paleoclimatology. Okay. We see folks like George Perkins Marsh, an American, writing things like Man and Nature, physical geography. Okay. A really important text, in line with those conversations about human environment interactions and whether the environment determines human societies or vice versa. Marsh's idea was that man, in fact, made the earth, okay? A pretty revolutionary concept at the time to say, well, actually, instead of earth making or determining society, it's indeed society that makes earth. We shape climates by clearing forests, so on and so forth. Alfred Russel Wallace, an important precursor to Darwin, who emphasized the role of natural selection and charted out a new subdiscipline of biogeography that illustrates how different species occur across the surface of the earth. William Morris Davis, an important geographer and pretty much the founder of geomorphology, who drew on Darwin's ideas of evolution and applied them to a landscape context, applied them to river systems in particular, to show that over time, river systems evolve from young river systems where rivers are maybe more canyonous and still interacting with their surroundings, through to mature systems and eventually old systems where the river has reached a kind of equilibrium with its surroundings. So that is our discussion of physical geography and different approaches to observation in contemporary geography, in particular, positivist and empiricist type approaches that we see very present in physical geography. In the next mini lecture, and our final mini lecture, we will look at structuralism and post-structuralism, another set of ideas about how to observe the world around us through a geographical lens.